Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to our second talk of the AI in Education series. Again, my name is Patrick. Again, I organise these along with my colleagues from Lead. Um, just before we start, I just want to introduce our speaker today. We have today very lucky to have Dr. Mary Claire Kennedy, who is the Academic Integrity Lead at the University of Limerick. Um, uh, and she will be presenting today on academic integrity and also ethical aspects of Gen AI. Just a little bit about Dr. Mary Claire Kennedy. She was the co-organizer of the Navigating the New Frontier Generative AI and Academic Integrity Conference, which took place there recently in Limerick. But also, she is a contributor to the University of Limerick's Let's Talk AI initiative, which is a 5-day course addressing staff concerns about their level of Gen AI literacy. She's also appeared on several several media outlets, including TV3's Ireland AM. And so we're very lucky, and I just want to turn the time over to Dr. Kennedy now to present to us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pat. It's wonderful to be here and to be joined by so many people. So what I'm going to do hopefully today is bring you through my presentation and then allow some time for questions and discussion at the end. So, while I appreciate the questions, if you could shore them up to the end, that would be wonderful, and we can tackle them there, unless of course there's a very pressing concern. So what I'm going to do now is share my slides. You'll note we're being recorded. So, very happy for you to look at content that I'm around my slides after this session, and the references are on the slides as well. So just bear with me for a moment now. Okay, so and I'll put it in presentation mode. So as Pat mentioned, my name is Dr. Mary Claire Kennedy, and I am Academic Integrity Lead at the University of Limerick. So I'm a pharmacist by training, and you might wonder how a pharmacist has kind of wandered into the space of academic integrity. And I worked for many years in the United Kingdom in the University of Leeds, and upon joining the university as a junior lecturer, I joined the plagiarism committee as something that I thought would be a good part for my service and scholarship, and to kind of enhance my understanding of how things like that were managed in the university. And like most things in life, I signed up for maybe a year, and then I found myself as chair of the committee after a few years. And it was a wonderful learning experience for me as a lecturer. And it's a little bit complicated in healthcare, as it is for some other groups that are maybe externally accredited by regulators, in that we had many postgraduate students who were registered nurses, pharmacists, midwives, etc. And unfortunately, in more extreme cases of academic misconduct, we would have to get the regulator involved. And so it was a difficult world at times for me, and was certainly quite a steep learning curve. But I've taken a lot of that learning, hopefully, and a lot of that experience, and really my kind of modus operandi with all matters to do with academic integrity is to do so compassionately, while also staying true to what the institution needs to uphold its quality of education. So classically, I think my slides might have frozen. Oh, wait, no, I think we're okay. So I'm proposing to base this presentation around 3 core questions, and I'm going to keep an eye on my time on the side. You see me looking sideways, I'm looking at my time. And they really are: how did we get here? What will we do now that we are here? And then where do we go from here? And I wanted to kind of bring a little bit of novelty to the presentation today and try and think about how I might tell a story around these 3 questions. And what I've decided to do is go with one of my favorite movies as a child, which was Alice in Wonderland. And what I feel like has been going on for the last 2 years is we're like Alice, and we've fallen down the rabbit hole, down into a world, and we don't know where the end is. We don't know what world we're entering into, what characters are there, what's going to happen, how we're going to get out of there. So it's nearly an alternate reality, I suppose, that we've entered into with the emergence of generative AI into the higher education space. And I think we're still maybe trying to make sense of it. So allow me to maybe set up some of my core understanding of where academic integrity sits in higher education in order to make sense of AI now that it's entered into that space. So fundamentally, I see academic integrity is as a sort of social contract. So, if we think about social contracts, we might think about general society, and in our country, we entrust the government to act on our behalf, to have a good social framework, to support those in need of support. And generally, in a democratic setting, that runs along relatively well. And I suppose if you think about that and take those assumptions into the higher education space, I see it as a type of social contract whereby the general public entrusts the higher education institution to have a set of rules and provide quality education in a way where we can trust the graduates that are produced at the end of the day. And so there is a trust between society and the education space. Obviously, there are regulators that kind of help to enforce that. But there's also a trust between the institution and students that if we establish these set of rules, that they will be followed. And for those individuals who fail to follow them, there will be implications for them. And so it's what keeps the social fabric running along and the social fabric of institutions running along quite well, I believe, anyway. And the other thing about academic integrity is it's seen as, I suppose, a third space. You might have heard that before, and certainly my colleague down in UCC, Loretta Goff, has written about it being a third space. And I think in saying that, what we're saying is it's a form of academic citizenship. So it sits kind of outside of traditional academic roles, which would be, teaching and research and assessment. And sometimes it's tacked on to somebody's role, or sometimes an educator, if they have to follow through a case from an academic misconduct viewpoint, would see it as an additional extra onto the job. But in order to kind of uphold the entire social contract within the institution, we require good academic citizenship to make it worse. So really what I'm saying is that it is an entity that is really, really important to the entire higher education space and the quality of qualifications that are going out there. But to a large extent, we're kind of left to do whatever it is we do to manage that within our own institutions. Now, obviously, and as I move through the presentation, I'll talk about maybe some of the frameworks and the guidance that we can incorporate into that. The other thing I'd like to touch on, just in terms of my own kind of understanding and assumptions that I make around academic integrity, and this is loosely based on Ellis and Murdoch's academic integrity pyramid. It's a highly distilled and highly simplified way of thinking about this. But bear with me as I kind of work through this for a moment. So I see higher education as largely a place for adult learning, or, we're transitioning from maybe pedagogic to andragogic learning. So we're requiring the individual to self-regulate their behaviors. So to direct and orient and understand what their learning needs are, to close any gaps they might have in their knowledge, to, self-motivate themselves to undertake learning and assessment. And if you kind of equate that to how we behave on the roads, okay, as an example. So we largely entrust members of the public to go out onto our roads and to observe the rules of the road. So to stop at traffic lights, to look right when you go into a roundabout, etc., etc. So it largely works okay when we get people to behave like that. But at times we have to provide some educational supports to enable people to self-regulate their behavior. So in higher education space and around academic integrity, we provide literature or briefing or orientation and support materials to students and to staff to facilitate that engagement and to enable them to engage with academic integrity. And if you equate that to the roads, it might be like an information campaign on the radio or on television, maybe about good driving or on the motorway or something like that. That occasionally people need to be reminded of good practices in order for them to uphold the rules of the road. And then there's the very sharp end of the stick. And so that's enforced regulation. So when maybe the other measures haven't worked, that we require an individual to engage in training, there might be some sanctions associated with that. But that's, I suppose, for people who are found to be in breach of the rules. And in terms of the road, we think about penalty points. I know in the UK you had to do a weekend of training that you would attend in person to educate educate yourself on what you had done wrong. So, it exists in lots of other ways in society as well, this kind of structure. But generally, my role, I don't see it as a disciplinary role, even though I suppose sometimes externally people do view it as that. Rather, I see it as a supportive role to enable people to stay down at the lower ends of this scale. And so really what we're trying to do is strike the balance. And there's been quite a lot written around this, that we're moving away from this language of misconduct into a language of integrity and, upholding the ICAI values around academic integrity. And then there are some factors that might tip an individual towards more prone to being in a misconduct space than an integrity space. And we need to be aware of those. So multiple assessments occurring around the same time, the educational context, the sociocultural context, or, the life things that are going on with that individual. And I suppose with all humans, regardless of what the circumstances are, when under pressure, we can sometimes make bad decisions. And that is what can feed into around assessment and higher education, what causes an individual to make bad decisions. I think some of the literature is beginning to move on a little bit on this, and I attended, as many of you did as well, Dr. Sarah Eaton's talk on human rights and thinking about some of the language and the assumptions we've made around this in recent years, what predisposes an individual to breaching academic integrity. And I think we might begin to see, I suppose, a slight change of perspective on some of these factors, that this is maybe an oversimplification on what predisposes an individual, and some of it's about the core assumptions we're making. We're working in a westernized education setting with certain expectations that have just been carried on from our own educational setting, and so imposing those on maybe somebody coming from a different setting is not necessarily, it's simply because they come from a different setting, and it's not necessarily incorrect. So I do acknowledge that this is, maybe we're moving on a little here, and I really valued Sarah's views on that, and it really stopped me in my tracks a little. What I'd like to do now maybe is just take a moment and think about AI and its interruption on us in the higher education sector, and thinking about the change that we're all going through. I worked as a pharmacist on and off during the pandemic, and the, I suppose, enormous change that it presented to healthcare professionals from what we were doing in practice was so different to what we had ever done before, how we interacted with patients. And it was very upsetting for us at times that we couldn't meaningfully engage as we would have liked to. And this curve was often taken out for us to self-assess, how did we feel at that moment in time, and where did we want to go to next, and really to put some structure in our thoughts. So I thought, that similar challenges like AI and the education space might be good for us to try and frame where we think we are. So if you could, in the chat, I'll stop sharing my screen so I can have a good look at this. If you could share with me where you think you are personally on the Kubler-Ross curve as it relates to AI and learning and assessment, and then where you think your institution is on this curve. So I suppose I'll self-declare first. I feel I'm probably somewhere around the experimentation phase, decision phase. I think maybe start of last year I was maybe in a bit of a depression phase around, I don't know what to do, and there's all this conflicting information. And I think my institution is around that experimentation phase as well. We're kind of tentatively putting our toes into the water. So I'll stop sharing for a moment. So if you could put 1 and 2 and put beside it where you think you are, whether you think you're at frustration, depression, experimentation, etc. I'll leave it up for a moment so you can put in your thoughts, and then I'll have a look. Stop sharing so I can see that. Thanks. I don't know if anyone else is. Yeah. Experimentation. Yeah, frustration, experimentation. Lovely. Thank you. Okay, so that's yeah, so we're still, I suppose, maybe kind of coming out of a depression. And the other thing, I suppose, it's not linear, that some days we might feel like, yeah, great, I'm getting somewhere with this, and then you go back to thinking you're a bit further back on the scale. So hopefully as well, I think the useful thing about this is that it's reassuring as well. And it's something that I often talk to my colleagues about, that we feel that, oh, are we missing something? Or, is there something that there's a silver bullet that we are not aware of? And actually, when you look at where everyone else is, we're all kind of in the same space. And I think there is reassurance in understanding that as well. So thank you so much for sharing those. What I'm going to do, integration, well done. Well done, Mark, that's fantastic. And so hopefully maybe at the end we can get some of those nuggets of things that you have managed to successfully integrate. Okay, so I'll move back to the slides if that's okay, and move on to the next part. Okay, so what we're moving on to now is the next question that I've set up this presentation around, which is, what will we do now that we are here? Okay, and how this relates to my overarching theme of Alice in Wonderland is this lovely quote, which is, why sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. And that really speaks to all the information that we're getting on the subject at the moment. Before I even get out of the bed in the morning, which I know is a bad habit, pick up my phone, see what people are saying on LinkedIn, and I get overwhelmed with literature, blog posts, podcasts, etc. on this subject. And some of it's useful, some of it's a reiteration of things I've already heard. And sometimes it's really difficult to integrate what that means for in my space. And because it is such an emergent area, there is a lot being spoken about this out there. And that can make it really difficult for us to feel like we are staying on top of everything that's going on in the space, and making us feel maybe that we're missing something. So what I'd like to do now maybe is to discuss institutionally where we have come from and now that we are here, and maybe some of the supports that we have integrated to help us in that space. Okay, and again, my slides are on a go slow. Okay, so many of you might have heard of the term VUCA, and this is used in a military context to describe a situation which is volatile, unstable, uncertain, and complex. And I was at the EUA conference a few weeks ago, and many of you might have been there, and a speaker spoke about the general higher education context being a kind of a space for VUCA at the moment because of a lot of the political and cultural challenges that we're facing. But AI presents a challenge around that as well. And Mairead Prachkin, in her wonderful book, if you've not managed to have a look at it, in one of her chapters discusses VUCA as well around this space. And yes, I think we are in this space of VUCA, but I would not despair necessarily. And I think many of us in Ireland are maybe in a slightly better space than we realise around academic integrity and AI and the supports that are available to us. So we have regulation around AI in the EU, and you know about the EU Act and the structures that puts on around risk management around that. And I think we're a little way away from embedding that into practice, but it's there, and regulatory frameworks are always really helpful to have. UNESCO has come out with guidance, NAIN has come out with wonderful guidance as well, and I'll speak to that in a moment. The AI Advisory Council has recently issued guidance around education and AI in recent weeks. The HEA, National Teaching and Learning Forum. We have wonderful inter and institutional collaborations, and in my world that's largely facilitated by NAIN, but I've had some other happenstance collaborations as well, which are really good to share local knowledge, and people are further down a path than you on certain experimentation with certain things. And then we have local case studies, and within our own space in UL we have facilitated exchange of local case studies, but also the National Learning and Teaching Forum have done that for us as well, and then conferences, etc. So I think it is easy for us to sit in our institutions and think, I have no guidance or I have no structure on this, but actually we have multiple layers going from very formal regulation right through to kind of case studies. And that is perhaps in a better space than many other countries find themselves in around this subject. So I wouldn't necessarily despair that much. And as I mentioned, the National Academic Integrity Network, for those who are joining us from other jurisdictions, this is our national body which promotes academic integrity. It's supported by QQI. And they have published many wonderful publications over the past few years, one of which focuses on artificial intelligence. And, rather than, I suppose, them being they're quite general documents, overarching supportive framework documents that you can take then and bring to your institution and think about marrying up your local processes with the guidance that's provided within these documents. And these are very much, they're will be reviewed and revisited by NAIN in by different working groups in NAIN, and be added to by other resources as well. So as I say, this has been and has predated the emergence of AI as well. So those network and that community has been established before the current crisis relating to academic integrity. For those of you who are not aware as well, in recent weeks, our AI Advisory Council published some guidance around AI and education, quite broad guidance, but really helpfully, they further clarified this position on AI detectors within the document, and this reflects or mirrors the guidance that's been given out by NAIN on this subject as well. And AI detectors are one of those things that I think that causes us to wonder, are we doing the right thing? And that we have other jurisdictions who'll talk about incorporating it into their methods around detection. We have this Swiss cheese model where it's one frame or one slice of the cheese around engineering, and there's other factors that help to mitigate against breaches of academic integrity. And then you have, I don't know if any of you follow Anna Mills on social media, but she has recently come out with a blog post, which is very interesting, where she was completely against the use of AI detectors due to the potential for false positives or false accusations being made. But she's beginning to think that maybe they have a role in conjunction with other ways of examining academic misconduct. So at the moment in Ireland, I suppose and in our own institution, we don't support AI detectors, but I think we have to be very much open to the possibility of them perhaps having a role in the future, maybe as technology changes, or maybe we will, as I will discuss later in my presentation, move away from this kind of detection narrative and policing narrative altogether. But there is, I suppose, layer upon layer of guidance being given to us, and it provides assurance to us in our institutions that we are making the right decisions. And as well, the HEA through the National Teaching Forum have come out with these 10 considerations in recent weeks, and these are relevant to all stakeholders in institutions. You can access them through the National Learning Teaching Forum website and provide feedback on how you think, I suppose, how robust you think these are. I'll talk in a moment about the principles we've developed in UL and how they work for us around generative AI. But again, we have these kind of overarching principles that we can then take and distill down into our own setting, not necessarily taking all of these, but taking what's relevant to us in our practice. So I think the main message I'm trying to get through here is we're not alone. And this thing that I mentioned at the start, I've believed many is 6 impossible things before getting up in the morning. Yes and no, in that actually we have very trustworthy stakeholders and groups and organizations giving us this guidance, and it's a wonderful starting point for us. So I'd like to maybe turn to our own institution in UL and just talk about maybe using us as a case study of some of the things we've done that we find work well, and some things we'd like to maybe take another look at. And we're going to look at the structure of what we've done, so organizational considerations, the process of what we've done, and then the outcome and how we're seeking to embed those decisions and re-examine those going forward. So let me look at the structure to start with. So we have a standalone academic integrity unit within our institution, and it's myself and 2 of my colleagues, Dr. Fionn McGrath and Dr. Silvia Bonini, who are our educational developers. And this is supported by SATL funding, and we're really, I suppose, it's really wonderful to have a unit with a distinct role around academic integrity. And I like to call this make it somebody's job. And the good thing about making something like this somebody's job is it doesn't get added to the bottom of the list. So if you make something like academic integrity or policy making or policing around things like looking at misconduct as kind of a point two of somebody's job, it can often fall by the wayside. But giving people space to look at this meaningfully means they can scan the horizon for threats coming up. They can respond very rapidly to emergent threats, issue guidance, etc. So, for example, when DeepSeek was released a few weeks ago, myself and my team could respond very quickly to that, released a short podcast about what this meant for us as an institution, make sure people were quite clear on what it was and what it wasn't, and be quite proactive. And you can only do that if you make it somebody's job and give somebody space to do that. But having said that, I do acknowledge that institutions are different. There's different sizes, different funding issues, different organizational structure issues. And so a piece of work I've been doing as part of Working Group 5 and alongside my counterparts in other universities is to map out the roles and responsibilities that might exist around academic integrity. So you might have a combination of these roles. You might have different names, but they're kind of fulfilling some of the same roles and responsibilities. And really what we're trying to do with this piece of work, and you might see more on this in the coming months, is to provide a framework to institutions if they're thinking about revamping or remodeling academic integrity in their own institutions. What are the possibilities that are open to them? I still go back to my single thought on this, though, which is if you make it somebody's job, you're in a much better position to handle the unknown going forward. And it is such a cornerstone, such a pillar of quality in education that why should it be left to being point something of somebody's role? It should be as important as the Quality Assurance Office example, which is core to most institutions. From a process viewpoint, so we have been doing quite a lot of work in the last year to set up certain policies and processes to make sure that our institution is quite clear on a roadmap that this should be followed around academic integrity. So I joined UL in December 23, and when I joined, lots of conversations with colleagues, and they were telling me, I don't know what to do. I'm hearing one message over here, another message over here. Is AI banned? So I know some students are using it. I don't know what to say to them. And there was, in an absence of guidance, practices begin to emerge, and that's only natural. And so one of my first jobs was to issue some interim guidance on setting out where we stood as an institution in relation to AI. And it's a document that, while it's only brief, we've kind of pointed back to again and again. That's really helpful for educators so they know how to position themselves around AI for their teaching and learning. And then more recently, we've had our academic integrity policy and procedures approved as well. And within that, we take care, we reference unauthorized content generation, and I suppose that provides, it builds on the interim statement and provides a structure to manage individuals who fail to comply with the regulations that we have set out or the expectations we have as a university. So I think, the interim statement was a very pragmatic and rapid measure to counteract the VUCA environment that I found myself in starting off in my role. And I think in the development of policy and processes, many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the really important kind of measures around co-production and meaningfully engaging with stakeholders. From my healthcare background, we talk about this as public patient involvement, or even on the ground as a healthcare professional, shared decision making. So the thinking of that is if you involve a patient or an advocate at the very, very start of a decision making process, so starting a medication, introducing a treatment, you are much more likely for that individual to follow on with the recommended treatment and to have success over time. So they're more likely to adhere to what you're suggesting because they were involved at the decision making at the outset. So in terms of policy making, that carries on here too. People want to be involved and want to feel heard. And so I took this model into policy development and really integrated it into the process to produce our policy and procedures. So things like creating a space for discussion, power sharing, so that there wasn't a hierarchy. And, we had people from different roles in the university, different levels of experience, grades, etc. When we came into a room, we were a relationship of equals, and people had equal vote or power in their vote about how we proceeded. This bit around enhancement of knowledge, I think it's really important to recognize that, we might have these individuals in a room, but there's always scope to consult somebody external to our institution to sense check something. And that's something we did as part of our process. But also to chat to people on the ground and see what they think about a topic, or involve expertise. That we have some expertise in AI in our institution, and we kind of have collaborated with those individuals about how AI works and to enhance our own understanding. Really frustratingly, and I think this is something we just need to be open to, is that it's not a linear process. So we might think we're making great headway in forming a policy or forming a guideline, and then something emerges or somebody makes a point and you kind of have to go back and revisit some of your assumptions. So there's a lot of over and back. And I think in the policy we've developed, we have said that we will revise it, or review it at least, and receive feedback in the next year, and then and quite frequently thereafter. And it's being open to that this isn't going to be perfect, and there's a lot of learning going on around the subject matter, and the landscape will change. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be completely watertight, given the uncertainty and complexity of this environment. So I mentioned the HEA considerations, and that has come out in the past few weeks. I suppose before that, we had worked as an institution to develop some Gen AI principles, and you can access them on our website. And these are 5 principles that anyone in our institution, so regardless of their role as a stakeholder, can buy into or seek to map to their own setting. So, for example, you might be professional staff, you might be in a lab as a researcher, a PhD student, etc. But if you are seeking to integrate AI into the work that you're doing, you can look at these principles, and we've suggested what these might mean from your position or place in the institution. So, and this, I suppose, is kind of thinking about that bridge between national guidance that's given out in a subject and your own institutional context. I do think it is important to try and bridge that gap between the local and the national or the international, because I suppose people within an institution will look first to see what institutional guidance exists before progressing elsewhere, perhaps. And the other thing that we have sought to incorporate as well are these different scales or frameworks. And let me just pause a moment and discuss these, and maybe discuss some of my thoughts on these, if that's okay. So many of you might know Danny Liu in the University of Sydney has this wonderful framework, the CRAFT framework, around thinking of integrating AI into assessment and different layers we might need to think about. And he has a menu of options about how we integrate AI into assessment. Of course, Mike Perkins and FIRS have this 5-step AI assessment scale that's been translated into many languages at this stage. And actually, this is a model that we support or endorse in our own institution as, I suppose, an off-the-shelf framework that when people are thinking about integrating AI into assessment, that it's a ready-made and fairly easy to engage with structure for anyone regardless of their academic discipline. And then there's also this framework that's proposed by Mary Davis in a book from Generative AI that's edited, or it's edited by Sue Beckingham and published by Routledge, if anyone's interested. And she speaks about a case study she conducted in her setting, taking the 4 principles of UDL and comprehension and working with students to map what they consider to be appropriate and inappropriate practices around AI. So another approach or another framework that we might think about. And I think frameworks like this are wonderful, and what they are, I suppose, for people who, we know how busy educators are in higher education institutions, how little time sometimes they have to change and pivot how they work, because the academic year waits for no man. And then by the time you have time to revise, you can be under pressure from other viewpoints. So there needs to be, I suppose, something that's easy to engage with, and to allow us to incorporate AI into how we're working as educators. I would suggest, though, and in my final piece of my presentation today, I would suggest that maybe we might move past these frameworks in time, or they might be a component of how we think about assessment and AI, but not be the only way we think about it going forward. And then finally, from an outcome viewpoint in relation to this, something that I've had to be quite responsive to are the layers of stakeholders that feed into my thinking and my communications around academic integrity in my institution. Obviously, educators and students are always going to be core. How I distill a message down, they are ultimately my key stakeholders. But there are other layers as well. And I suppose just because you're on the outside doesn't mean you're less important. I suppose it's just how central you are to implementation of policy and procedures. This somewhat, some of you might be aware of Sarah Eaton's 4M framework, which is micro, meso, macro, and mega levels. This is a slight adaptation of that, and takes into account, I suppose, because it's from my institutional setting, how I've mapped my stakeholders. I won't dwell on this too much, but something I'd like to point out to you are two things. The Research Integrity Office maybe is something that doesn't naturally occur to us here. But I've had to work quite closely with my counterpart in research integrity. And the reason for that is that we need to have very clear understanding the lines of responsibility, and our communications and messaging around generative AI. If we have hugely divergent practices in our institution, that's quite confusing for researchers and staff, and it's also quite contradictory as well from somebody outside looking in. And the other piece here is around industry and practice partners. And this is something I'll come to in my final bit of my presentation, which is that what's going on outside of the institution ultimately might have more power or more influence than we realize at the moment. And we have to be quite responsive to what's going on out there. So the final piece then, before I pause for questions, will be around where do we go from here? And this goes back to Alice asking the Cheshire Cat when she's trying to find her way out of Wonderland. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? And the cat says to her, that depends a good deal on where you want to go. And I think this is quite pertinent for us as educators. Where is it we want to end up? Have we decided that? Do we know what that world looks like? Do we need to let go of certain assumptions that we've always held about assessment and to try and navigate our way out of this? So let me introduce some of my thoughts around that. The economic and social demands that might be ultimately a driver for change more than we can ever expect on this subject. And this goes back to something called Amara's law, which is we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. And I really like this GIF that we often joke with in our team, that everything's fine, meanwhile, the world's on fire around you. And this rings true. This is not a recent kind of assumption. We go back to Keynes, the economist, and in the 1930s, he suggested that we might be looking at a 15-hour working week in decades to come. And of course, we aren't. And I suppose there have been other assumptions that have been made post-COVID. We might be looking at a 4-day working week because we can work so much better in an online setting. That's not necessarily come to pass yet. And so similarly with AI, I think maybe certain assumptions are being made, but whether they are true at the end will remain to be seen. So I think we can see it as this big cataclysmic event, but the dust has to settle a little before we see what it means. I'd like to point to a study that's been done by the ESRI about what they predict the role of AI is in our skill set as an economy. And they did a really nice study and looked at LinkedIn ads. And they mapped out how many LinkedIn ads had AI literacy as a key skill. And you can see here about a third of adverts in that time had AI as a key skill that was required. And so this is only likely to expand and increase. So this might put backward pressure then on us in the higher education sector to make sure that we have staff and students that are literate and competent at AI. We might be forced into that because of the economic and social expectations that are being placed upon us. So I think it's possibly something that we should recognize the world will move on, and are we moving with it? And allied with that, then, we recently ran a survey in UL. Now, it was quite small scale. We had 160 students responding and 110 staff. And we asked them multiple questions across various domains. But one thing we did ask them was about their levels of confidence with Gen AI. And I found this really enlightening. So the greenest staff, the bluest students, and they're not that different. So we're, somewhat confident, extremely confident, but the two populations are quite similar. And so there is this assumption sometimes we make about the digitally native generation that they must be so much more advanced and be much more confident. And that's not necessarily the case. So I would argue then we can't neglect AI literacy as being a core skill we're rolling out or seeking to support. So in UL, as Pat mentioned at the start, we have a few different initiatives. We have a Let's Talk Gen AI set of a series that ran last year and this year for staff. And we have a workshop for students that has run as well. And we're seeking to think about other ways we support AI literacy for students. And then we have a podcast that my team primarily run it, but we invite external collaborators as well. And my thinking here with this is that I suppose with my generation, millennial and younger generations, we're much more likely to engage with audiovisual context or formats. So if somebody says, I have a 10-minute podcast on that, I'll think, oh yeah, great. I'll listen to that as I walk through campus. We have a wonderful campus. It'll take 10 minutes to walk from here to there. Rather than me trawling through a website and thinking, what does this mean for me? If it's explained to me through my headphones, that I'm much more likely to take that meaningfully on board. It's just the way I work, maybe, but I think it's the way the world is headed a little as well. So, and it allows us, as I say, to be quite responsive to the emergent landscape. This thing around VUCA and how we take this on going forward. So something we asked in the survey is, were students concerned about breaching academic integrity? And we can see here about 40% were extremely concerned. And so 30% were somewhat concerned. About 75% of our students are quite concerned about breaching academic integrity with their use of AI. And then the other question we asked, is it clear to you when you're authorized to use it? And rather worryingly, a third of them said, no, it wasn't clear. So we've got this combined picture of they're not sure what they're allowed to do, and then they're also really concerned about breaching academic integrity. So it's kind of says to me in my role, are we doing enough to spread the message about what's authorized? So building on that VUCA, some steps that I think are important for us to bring into our institutions is to be quite clear about the rules of engagement. So regardless of whether you're somebody in my position or you're dealing on a module level basis with students, be quite upfront about what is allowed, what is not allowed, and minimize that confusion, and then hope alleviate some of the concern that they have as well. So from my viewpoint, understanding the institutional landscape, that is something we've tried to do with our survey. If you've not done something similar in your own setting, it's been very enlightening for me, and kind of some of the assumptions that I had made were not true. And so that, and every institution is different. So looking at the literature isn't always helpful on this subject. Communicate rules of engagement, and be quite pragmatic in changing those rules of engagement if some other information comes to light. And then act if there's poor practices, absence of something happening in some sector or faculty, that is recognised. And I'm beginning to wonder, and this might not be a popular opinion, that whether we need to enter into a world of compulsory academic integrity training. If our students are so concerned about breaching academic integrity, are we really meeting them where their needs are? Do we need to require academic integrity training to address some of those concerns that they have, and in essence to help them? And if we go back to the driving kind of illusion that I made, is it giving them their driving license that they're trained to a minimum standard, now go out and bring that forward into your own practice? And the final thing then for questions, so I'll just be 2 minutes in case you're wondering where I'm at. thinking about meaningful change from an education viewpoint. And, I'd like you to think back to those frameworks that I mentioned as well in this discussion and about where we're headed with those. So again, going back to my survey for a moment, I asked students, and this is an anonymous survey, were you aware of unauthorized generative AI use? And nearly half of them said yes. And then tellingly, a third said not sure. And so we can read into that what we will, whether they were genuinely not sure or they were just not willing to declare that they were aware of unauthorized Gen AI use. Who knows? But then we also asked staff and students about how they feel, if they feel it would be appropriate to use generative AI in summative assessments. And you can see here probably a little bit split, but beginning to creep into more than 50% saying they somewhat agree or strongly agree that it should be used in assessment. So what I'm saying here is the world is moving on past us. Students are using generative AI in assessment. And we're also beginning to have students and staff agreeing that it should be embedded in assessment in certain circumstances. So I think we're going to have to move with what the landscape, certainly in my institution, is telling me, which is we are going with this and we're beginning to have to integrate this. So we're at the integration stage or seeking to move to integration stage, although getting to that point might be more difficult than it sounds. So something that you might have seen in the literature that I've seen quite a lot as well is with AI in mind that we focus on the process and not the product. So we assume that AI can produce the product. And so really what we should be assessing is the process and engagement with the process and a student's ability to critically evaluate and appraise the stages in the process. And that is, I suppose, an admirable kind of proposal to make, but practically I have some concerns about that in practice. And so it's about metacognition. And it might be appropriate, but there are, as I say, some concerns I have. So there would need to be some agreement on what we're focusing on to assess if we're looking at their ability to critically appraise or evaluate content that's being produced by AI. That might be a more difficult assessment rubric than we traditionally have by looking at a product, which is much more easy to look across a few domains. The other thing I have a concern about is that by moving too quickly to metacognition, we neglect some earlier steps that are important to get to metacognition. So if you think about it from reading and from object level cognition. So a child will, through phonics and through supports in school, will be able to read the words on a page. And largely because they're so focused on reading the words on the page, their ability to stand back and think about the story overall might take a little time to get to that point. So usually after a few years of education, you can get to the point of comprehension. So they're asked questions about, their understanding of the reading they've undertaken. And then if not, they can go back and reread it and assess their understanding. But if we take that into the educational space and higher education, the same things ring true. You have to have the core skill built up in the first place in order to get to the metacognitive level or the more complex level of appraisal or judgment. So I would suggest that things like incorporating AI into assessment are helpful, maybe as an individual might move through higher education. But at its more fundamental level, we need to make sure that we've built up that competence or skill set in the first instance to get to the end point. So I think with the move towards really embracing generative AI, I would be concerned about neglecting core skills that are going to be really important to get to the metacognition level in the end. So what I would suggest as educators is we go back to basics on assessment, that we look at validity. And there's been much talk about the authenticity of assessment with generative AI, but that is not the only picture when it comes to validity. We talk about security, we talk about content validity. There's lots of different things we think about in validity. Reliability, is it feasible? So we might suggest an alternative, is that scalable? And there have been some discussion around scalability of different assessment means. Acceptability, is it acceptable to staff and students? And we might think about accessibility in that for different needs that individuals have, and its impact on learning. whether it's off or as an assessment piece for learning. So I think my take-home message here is we sometimes can hone in on one of these dimensions, but we upset the apple cart too much if we think only about authenticity and only about security and say, okay, we're going to make our assessment this, and we completely neglect some of the other things that are really core to assessment as well. So I would think that rather than, I think every academic discipline and indeed educator in that space needs to go back to their own discipline, think about maybe where we're headed from a professional viewpoint in that discipline, and think about redeveloping their assessment with these principles as a whole in mind, not just one or two of these in mind. So how can I make my assessment more secure? Sure, we can suggest ways of doing that, but does it upset some of the other factors? So just leaving with some final thoughts on this then. This is a really exciting time. It might not feel it, and I can see from the Kubler-Ross curve that it probably doesn't feel it at the moment for us. But I think we might look back and think about, like we did with COVID, it opened up things that we did not think were possible before, and there's a kind of a difficult piece to navigate in that. But I think we need to navigate it quite pragmatically and move, and it's this point to make, if you fail to jump, you can fall through the gap. And so we need to be less, I suppose, concerned about perfectionism in policy and procedures, but do something pragmatic to avoid an information vacuum and poor practices developing. Meaningfully collaborate. I so often hear discussion about, involving stakeholders, but really, to what extent, how meaningfully has that taken place, and how does that continue over time as well? I'm not saying that we have a right in our institution, but it's something that for things to work and for staff and students to be honest with us, like they have been within our survey, we need to have that relationship set up. And then we need to revisit some of the core assumptions we have made and not necessarily go with the latest framework or scale or whatever it is that might be helpful to fill the gap at the moment. But going forward, we might have to just reevaluate our thinking completely around assessment while kind of taking in some of those core assumptions. So that's me. If you want to contact me, this is our email address at UL. It's on our website, but you'll also find me on LinkedIn and Blue Sky as well. So more than happy to take questions. So these are the references if anyone is interested afterwards. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now and see where we're at with questions. Thanks, Emil.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. Just want to open the floor now to questions, to anybody who might want to share some questions. We just had one question, whether the slides will be shared. I don't know.
Yeah, happy to share them. Yeah, no problem.
No worries. So if you let's have a look. If you want to just put your questions in the chat, and then what I can do is I can actually even if you put your hand up, I can unmute you and you can ask the question directly. Oh, we have a question from Catherine, from Kate.
Hi, Mary Claire. Thank you for that. Very, very thought-provoking. I'm involved with students on their research projects. And while the actual project is okay because it's a self-reflective piece and they have to do journal entries all the time, it's just around the literature review and how you can give them that skill set of looking through the literature and finding what they need. Like, it's a very important process. But then the final assessment just being their own work. I suppose it's a concern for me now at this stage.
And I suppose we know that AI and some research platforms in AI can do literature reviews in very quick time. I would think we need to be quite pragmatic about that. And I'm coming from my own space in healthcare, where Cochrane have come out with a series of webinars in recent months, actually talking about how we can use AI at different stages in the literature review and the systematic review process. So Cochrane are recognizing that it has a role in efficiency, but ultimately, obviously, the researcher has some nuanced decision making they can bring to that based on their own academic discipline. So I would say, indeed, and so that kind of speaks to your point there, which is people need to know the stages and the processes in order to, even if the AI tool is doing some of the heavy lifting, for them to actually critically evaluate the output the AI tool is giving them. So I don't have any easy answers for you. I do wonder if you think about bringing something like Perkins's scale to that, whether you permit certain levels of use, that you get them to evidence that, to critically evaluate how well they did. So for example, mesh terms or Boolean search terms or something like that, to get them to critically appraise if they are using an AI tool to supplement that they can critically evaluate that. Because I suppose I recently have been starting to try and put together a systematic search, and I asked AI to put together a Boolean search set of phrases for me, and it was hopeless. And because I suppose I had that knowledge that it was hopeless. So it's to use the two in tandem might be the bit that is the gap you're assessing there, I wonder. But it's not impervious to threat, no.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's been my kind of, to allow them to say they're allowed to use it in the design phase and to get keywords, to get a broader understanding of the topic. But it's still, it's kind of challenging.
Yeah, and I suppose it's only as good as the operator is as well. So if they're
That's
not,
true.
clued in on good systematic search terms, that they won't be able to prompt for. So in a way, even in doing that activity, it will assess their knowledge and skill in the area.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? I just have a question actually myself. I suppose going forward, like with the introduction of AI agents and many other different new technologies coming in, especially with kind of thinking AI or reasoning AI, we should call it, like, is it going to get to a point where the AI will just simply do everything? That, yeah, you just say, do this for me and it'll do it, and it'll be in so, undifferentiated from actual human work that the whole process of an assessment becomes pretty much useless in terms of kind of, I know there are different ways you can assess where you can kind of mitigate the use of AI, but where do you think the future is going to go with this sort of thing?
I think it goes back to my point on deciding on working with society and from a professional viewpoint where we're at with that. Because I suppose if we think about things like diagnostics in healthcare or other things that are entrusted now to technology, or kind of predictive or kind of models that we would predict things that might happen, there, it does a lot of that heavy lifting and we leave it to do that. But there is about the human engagement with that, and I suppose the level that we can put together the grayness of a case that might present to us. And so you do need the human evaluative part of that, and I suppose the other things that make us human, the compassion, and our ability to interact with people. So I do take your point. I think ultimately, maybe not in the short term, that we're going to hand over a lot of this kind of skill set to our AI overlords. But that's not necessarily, there is always going to have to be a space for human responsibility, human accountability, and the things that make us human, trying to marry those two things together. And from an assessment viewpoint, we may have to, obviously, there might be some point where we're securing an assessment to make sure that people have those core skills if they're still important, but that we're beginning to incorporate that meaningfully into assessment, because ultimately it's about making people prepared for their future careers. And if that's what's happening in the workplace, that's what we have to do to prepare them in higher education.
Yeah,
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, that's absolutely wonderful. We've just time for one last question. We have a question from Anya. I'm just going to unmute your mic there, Anya. Yeah, you might need to unmute it yourself.
Apologies, I didn't realize I had to do that. Thanks, Mary Claire, fantastic presentation. I just wanted to move back there to the piece that you had about the academic roles and the integrity roles and the structures and that paper. When do you expect that to be, I suppose, available? Because I thought it's at this stage it's about, I think there's a couple of points to be discussed. It's how are they funded? There was some of it's by SATLI, some it's by core functions. And the authority that the officer has, particularly in relation to the investigation stage and sanctions. I know that you say like what Kane Murdoch is doing in the Australia is far above what we would at this point. But I think as things get more complex and so on, and you're trying to, and as more stuff starts to rise during coursework during the term, it's going to be more and more difficult for committees to meet and so on. And I think the other piece going back as well, you talked about developers, and I was wondering, were they involved more in the kind of the tech end, you know, kind of computer science experts, that sort of thing. I was just interested in that as well. I think if the paper can kind of discuss that, we've seen like in the last maybe 2 years, if I remember correctly, when the department took a very clear course of action in relation to the sexual violence and harassment posts and gave the institutions funding, that sorted that pretty quick. And my worry is that that won't happen until there is a crisis point in Ireland in relation to academic integrity.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And we're doing all sorts of different things.
So I suppose we're in the relatively early stages. We have developed as a group our roles and responsibilities. We've presented that through NAIN, but I think that we have recognised that we perhaps could incorporate individuals from other tertiary education sectors like ETBs into that, recognising that the I suppose the financial circumstances or the contractual circumstances of different groups will be different depending on the nature of the sector. So it is something we're hoping to work through and bottom out a little bit more in the coming months by involving maybe a wider group in that development process, and work with NAIN to have that I suppose communicated out. We're thinking it's probably going to be part of a larger piece of work, and hopefully consult with the ENAI, for example, to get feedback on maybe other jurisdictions' views on how they would position those roles. So that's where we're at with that. It's kind of a work in progress. I don't want to maybe promise too much just in the immediate future, but it is underway. And the developer role, you know, I suppose that's different depending on the level of responsibility, but we would view that as kind of either a policy developer role or an educational developer role. So somebody who's there to support education and training for staff and students. Sure, they might have a technical competency, but they might also have a pedagogical background. It would depend, I suppose, on the other skill sets in the team about what gap they're filling in that regard. I totally acknowledge, I agree, and it's, you know, something that even when I was in the UK, it was point 2 of my role. And I struggled to cater for cases when I worked there, and that was, you know, we had another university literally a mile down the road, completely different practices, and you know, that's not a good space to be in. So it is something that needs to be funded, and I agree. I think we're probably going to be driven by a crisis or negative media coverage, and that will drive it backwards in terms of prioritizing what's important in higher education. And I do think, as I say, making it somebody's job speaks to how you prioritize that in your institution.
Thanks.
Yep.
Okay, just one very quick question, just to finish up on. We have a quick question from Dana. She asks, would you be able to expand on a bit more, or sorry, reimagining assessment, would you be able to expand on that a bit more? I'm trying to be creative at secondary school level.
Yeah, so I suppose if we think about, let me think about something, how I can position this. So if you think about those frameworks that we have, and rather than focusing on the product of write this essay using this, I don't know, reflective model or something like that, because the AI can do that, but have maybe the AI produce some of the content, or ask the students to brainstorm with AI to produce content for that. And that this assessment itself is for students to appraise the output of the content that the AI has been that is produced for them. You might supplement that then with, there might be a written piece around that, but you might supplement that through a debate or a discussion in class. And I acknowledge it's kind of going back to what I was saying about you can't upset the apple cart too much, because how do you scale that? How you have to build a new rubric to be fair around that assessment. But it is about incorporating it to a certain extent to what's appropriate. But then what is the bit you are assessing? What's the skill set you're assessing? And that might be different to what you had done. The learning outcome might actually change now, because with the assistance of AI has caused you to move on. So that would be, I suppose, an example of something that we would often see in our institution about how people are incorporating it.
Okay, thank you so much. Just a special thank you to Mary Claire. Thank you so much. It was very, very informative. Cheers. Just before we finish, I put in the chat a link for our third talk, which is we're looking at, we have some colleagues from the University of Liverpool who are going to talk about adopting AI into your everyday work. So it'll be quite a practical talk, so which will be quite useful and interesting. And again, thank you again, Mary Claire, and for all attendees. We will have a recording. We'll be up on our website shortly. And thank you. And
Thanks so much, Pat.
See you soon. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.